Well, good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, depending upon where you are in the world, and welcome to today's DevOps.com webinar. I'm Charlene O'Hanlon, moderator for today's event, and I welcome you. As always, we have a great event on tap today, but before we get started, we do have a few housekeeping items we need to go over. First of all, today's event is being recorded, so if you miss any or all of the event, you will be able to access the webinar on demand. Following today's presentation, we'll be sending out an email that includes a link to access the webinar. And we are taking questions from the audience. So if you have a question for our presenter at any time during the presentation today, don't wait, don't hesitate, just use your GoToWebinar control panel and submit your questions. And we'll get to as many as we can near the end of the presentation. Okay, finally, we are proud to say that we are going to be once again offering 5 $50 Amazon gift cards to 5 lucky winners. We're going to be doing a random drawing near the end of today's presentation to get those get the names of those lucky winners. So stay tuned. Okay, with that, we'll go ahead and kick off today's webinar, which is Reaching Cloud Utopia: How to Create a Single Pipeline for Hybrid Deployments. Our speaker today is Vincent Lussenberg, who is Director of DevOps Strategy at CBI Labs. Hi, Vincent. How are you?
I am good. How are you guys doing?
Awesome,
Thanks for having me.
All right, great. Well, thanks for joining me today. And I know you've got a great presentation to get started on, so I'm going to put myself on mute and let you get started.
Excellent. All right. Well, thanks a lot for that introduction. And indeed, let's get started. I'll tell you a little bit about myself just before I get started, although I already got the introduction. I just want to mention that I've been with CBI Labs since 2011, so I've worked for the company both in Europe and in the US. I'm based in Colorado right now. And as Director of DevOps Strategy, I, of course, pay attention to the direction that the market is going, see what our customers are doing, making sure that whatever they're doing with our products is in line with the direction that the market is going. And I have a couple of insights that I would want to share with you today, and hopefully some things that are going to be useful for you guys as your companies might be hopping on the trends for 2019. Just a quick introduction for those of you who might not be familiar with CBI Labs. We've been part of the DevOps movement since the very early days. In fact, 2 years before the term DevOps was even officially coined. So we've solely focused on DevOps and continuous delivery, and we're repeatedly recognized as a leader by the top analysts in this space. You can find our customers, many of the best known and best run companies around the world. They're in all types of industries, from financial services to retail, manufacturing, all the way to public sector and government agencies. And there's a couple of examples to the right-hand side. So we've worked with these companies moving towards DevOps for their specific concerns that they have. And they might be looking to move applications to the cloud or start taking advantage of container technologies, maybe make continuous integration part of the broader software delivery process, include IT service management as well. So that's one of the trends in 2019, bridging the gap between CD and IT service management, really making sure that the ITSM and the DevOps world are completely connected. So we're on top of all of this, and there's a topic that we're going to discuss today. Since many organizations are struggling right now, security is a little bit in a state of crisis, especially in 2018. 2019 promises a bunch of new exciting things in that space. So they are really looking on how to embed security compliance and governance requirements in the way that they're delivering their software without sacrificing the speed that they're going at. So they don't want to introduce new security risk compliance violations. They still want to use DevOps best practices like CI, CD, automated testing, release, and security scanning. So that's a little bit of background for CBI Labs. Cool. So the trends that I really want to be talking about is both in security and cloud migrations. So what we're seeing is definitely that there is a movement standing up called DevSecOps, which is inspired by the fact that just DevOps introduced a couple of risks from a security point of view. And to address that, to really identify the fact that we as a DevOps movement and as software engineers in general are really concerned about that, we started by making sure that security practices are embedded in basically your enterprise pipeline. So the classic way of doing security in an organization, making it safe and standardized, is by running various type of security scan and audits by security professionals. But the problem that we're seeing is for every 100 developers, there's one security person. So what you're definitely going to see more and more there is that that person is not going to keep up with the speed that the organization wants to go at. So instead of that information living in that security person's head, it needs to be embedded in a process that these concerns are addressed automatically. Doesn't mean that that person isn't really auditing anything anymore. It's of course improving the process at all times. But it is really important to realize that in order to keep doing this in a way that security and cloud are not contradictory, like not pointing into a different direction, it's really important to embed that into your process. The other trend that we're definitely seeing, I mean, it's not a surprise, but cloud adoption and cloud migration is still speeding up. That means it hasn't plateaued yet. So a lot of the largest companies, the companies that we work with, are ramping up the workload that they're moving to the cloud. So it's not that they're mostly done. No, the majority of the workload is still coming. Of course, they want to leverage the cloud in order to be more fast and flexible to address these different concerns. And one of the goals that, one of the underlying reasons that I want to talk about this topic today is I want to paint you a picture where security and cloud are not really pointing in different directions. So there is a way of addressing both security and cloud so that you are scaling a solution that's fast, flexible, safe, and standardized. And that's, you know, one of the beginning rounds that I want to start with. Excellent. So I've defined a couple of practices, and if you read the abstract for the webinar, they're going to seem quite familiar to you. And I'm going to start with the first practice that I see, and these are practices that are based on industry trends, like research that I've done, my own direct experience with my customers, and just my background in software engineering. And I will underline why I think these topics are really important in order to reach cloud utopia. So before I really start with it, I want to underline that this webinar is really about reaching cloud utopia, not about being in cloud utopia. One of the things that I think about utopias in general is that you never really reach a utopia, you're always on the road to the utopia. So just like in that example, the enterprise pipeline where I would be talking about today is really focused on not being just reliable and good for your as-is state or for your utopia state where everything is in the cloud. No, it's really focused on being useful at every step on that road towards utopia, which, you know, probably will never reach because 2 years from now, something else is going to be changing that utopia. But still being on the path and getting better all the time, that's really what the goal is here, not just being at that state of utopia. So let's explain the concepts that I've outlined here a little bit. So when I talk about an enterprise pipeline, it's somewhat of a nebulous term, right? Like a lot of people can mean something different by it. So when I'm talking about a single enterprise pipeline, I'm really talking about visualizing, managing, orchestrating that entire path to production. Production really being the term that needs to be emphasized here. So there's a lot of pipelines currently in our industry. Not all of them lead to production. When I'm talking about an enterprise pipeline, the fact that it ends up in production is actually the most important part, because that means that you know that that pipeline actually gets you to the state that you want to go, and it visualizes whatever you're really doing in order to get to production. And in order to do that, what you will see is that that pipeline needs to handle a wild array of different things. It's not just like the beginning stages, and you might be familiar with Jenkins pipelines and whatever you do in Azure DevOps as well, which are great solutions to build your application, to do some initial security scanning. What is a lot harder to build into those is security, approvals, compliance requirements, making sure that it's auditable, not just for a technical audience, but for any audience, making sure that communication concerns are addressed, notifications that need to be sent out, like Slack messages, emails, texts, making sure that the separation of duties is clearly present and documented. Any concerns that you might have around reporting, might be regulatory reporting or just reporting to improve over time. All of these things are part of that enterprise pipeline, all part of those concerns. And why do you need all of those ingredients? Because otherwise it will be really hard to receive buy-in from all the stakeholders. So usually there's a group of people that control whether or not software makes it into production, right? And these people need to be absolutely sure that whatever requirements there are, they are being addressed. So without addressing these concerns outlined above, probably the people that are responsible to give you that buy-in in your organization are not going to sign off on that. So that's the reason why all of these concerns are actually very important, and it's important to not forget about one of the stakeholders, because you're not going to have a true end-to-end pipeline, and you're not going to get some of the benefits of actually getting a large speed improvements in order to get to production. On the right-hand side of the slide, we see two other important assumptions, caveats, corollaries, no matter how you want to call them. So an enterprise pipeline is for all applications, and that's in quotes because I want to underline a little bit that what I'm not really here is to advocate that you have one single enterprise pipeline for your entire enterprise, like one pipeline for a huge bank or an insurance company. That's maybe not really the most optimal solution. But at the same time, the mindset needs to be this enterprise pipeline is made in such a way that it's reusable. So if you have two different business segments that have very different criteria for compliance and auditability, for example, you're probably going to end up with two distinct enterprise pipelines because the way that you're going to production is different. But at the same time, you would lose a lot of value if you would go ahead and create a unicorn enterprise pipeline for every release that you're doing. So there's a lot of value in actually seeing, although there might be tiny differences right now between these release processes, what can we do to create a more uniform release process so that the stakeholders do not have to approve 500 pipelines, but instead maybe 5 for your entire organization, which of course is going to be a lot less red tape, etc. One of the other very important parts specifically for this webinar is the fact that it's going to be basically for all environments. So we are going to take a look at what I mean with the hybrid environments, right? And in this enterprise pipeline, it's really, really important that you don't change the enterprise pipeline whenever you're updating one of your environments. That might sound a little nebulous, a little cloudy, I might say, but I'm going to make that a lot clearer as I'm going to run through a demonstration of how that would look and a specific use case of a cloud migration. Cool stuff. I want to underline one of the other practices, and that is it's kind of obvious, right? You're not going to do a big bang migration. So you might have 300 applications, and it might be pretty obvious to you that migrating all of these 300 applications in one go, that's not really something that's possible. I mean, that's obvious. But even take a look at the smaller big bang, even for a set of very similar application, or even for a single application, you're not even probably going to do a big bang migration of all the environments. So if you're currently just running on legacy stuff, maybe Tomcat or JBoss or WebSphere, it doesn't really mean that tomorrow you're going to run everything on Kubernetes. Defining a migration process that assumes that to be the case will set you up for failure. Having a pipeline that supports you by taking baby steps towards that state, That's really the thing that you want. And at one point, if you've done 15 applications, you might actually be able to go faster because you've got a lot of experience doing these migrations. And then things will go faster, but your process needs to support basically whatever you're doing in first gear up to second, third, fourth, and fifth gear. So however fast you're going, the guardrails need to be present there. I want to underline another thing, because Big Bang always just implies going forward. And of course, we're doing DevOps here, and DevOps is a culture of rolling forward. And whenever I'm about to mention rollbacks, and whenever I mention that, people frown at that, and they're like, what do you mean rollbacks? We roll forward, that's not something we do. Are you trying to push some waterfall on me, etc., etc.? No, not really. I'm a big advocate of rolling forward as well, but do realize what rolling forward means. So that is usually used in context of I am developing a specific feature. Maybe I'm introducing a new subscription for my website. I'm putting that out there, and I'm discovering that that specific subscription, users with that subscription are incurring a problem. Maybe a report doesn't load, or they can't pay, or something like that. In that situation, you don't want to throw your hands up in the air, go back to the previous version, and just lose that subscription that people already started using, but want to fix that in place by rolling forward. In case of that, we're talking about environment migrations going to the cloud. It usually means if there is a problem, it means that the entire application is not coming up. So let's say that you've tested your Kubernetes implementation in dev and test very extensively, and now you're going to your UAT environment, and you're doing that through your pipeline. You've configured your environments. The moment you deploy, it doesn't come up for some reason. There's some problem. And in that case, it means there's nothing you can right now do in that environment. So what I'm advocating for there, make it easy to roll back to the state where you're using the old environment. So basically, don't put the migration to that cloud environment right there on the critical path for that release. That's something, there's going to be a next release. And when that happens, before that time, you can go ahead and figure out, okay, so what was the problem in that UNT environment? So make sure that you're okay with, if it really doesn't come up, being able to switch back to your old environment quite easily, so that you don't make the cloud migration a problem of the business value that you want to bring towards your customers. Because of course, that's when the people that actually requested these features are going to start complaining, and you don't want that for something that's plumbing and infrastructure, like going to the cloud, right? Finally, I want to mention that not all applications are created equally. So your migration strategy for application portfolio 1 might not work for application portfolio 2. And an example there that I want to use is, for some applications, you might want to containerize them right away, right? I've got a Tomcat war, and I can very easily create a Docker container for that and start deploying that to Kubernetes. That's great. But some applications are not really architected in that way. They are still reliant on running on their classic infrastructure. So in that case, your path to cloud might be more creating a dedicated EC2 instance or a virtual machine in Google Cloud or Azure DevOps or something like that. And running that basically in a very similar architecture as you have been doing in your own data center. I'm not saying that the one is the best practice or the other one is the best practice. Everything works in a certain context, and it's very dependent on how your application is architected. So really try to go fast. Try to make things as generic as possible, but do not assume that everything is going to be the same and you can just do it in one big go. You're going to set yourself up for failure. One of the other practices that I've seen that is actually quite important in order to make that process of embedding cloud and container technology very effortless is to reuse configuration. So people tend to think that if I'm using containers, that means that I don't have any configuration concerns anymore, and that is actually not accurate. And maybe it's not as relevant nowadays, but it used to be like really something that people wouldn't think about back in 2017, the beginning of 2018. So one of the things that's very important to realize is if you're running an application in that container, you're still going to have similar or the same, for example, database connections. The way that you pass that to a WebSphere, Tomcat, IIS application looks very different than the way that you pass that to a Docker container. But basically the entity that's behind that database connection, that schema that you have running, that is still the same. So it doesn't really make sense to maintain a second set of that configuration in that second format, but instead to have a single source of truth that basically documents, okay, what are really the entities that I have out there, and can I apply that dynamically to multiple different ways that I'm running my application, right? So at the same time, I want to use that configuration database for my Tomcat WAR and maybe the container version of that same application that I'm running on AWS ECS. And again, might seem a little high level. I have a pretty concrete example of that in the upcoming demo. The same, of course, goes for application settings. Generally, application settings are similar, but you pass them to the runtime in a different way, right? Where you have a property file for a WAR file, you might have a set of environment variables or a config map in Kubernetes. So that's going to look different, but you still want to source that from the same. At least that's one of the practices I found very useful. One of the things, and this is more, it's not really a practice, it's more a principle, I guess. It's good to realize that as you're going through your migration, that one of the essential parts there is that not every application is going to lend itself very well to be able to be ported to a cloud environment quite as easily. I did mention that as part of the Big Bang strategy, or the Big Bang part as well. So a lot of people that are doing this have been in IT for a longer time, just like myself. And I don't know if you guys remember the lessons doing the physical to VM migrations. So back in the day, I think I was working at a retailer, must have been 2004, 2005. They were running the majority of their stuff on mainframe, but they had 5 web servers that they have like this Frankenstein of Java and .NET applications, and they were using a whole bunch of different things that were running on those servers. There were 5 of them. And they were thinking of migrating that basically to VMware that started with reliable VM technology then. Of course, as you're doing that, you can port those machines one-to-one, just like upload them to VMware and start running them again. But the fact that you have flexibility to create these machines more on the fly might lead to more effective strategies of actually deploying that out. Because, of course, in a physical world, adding a machine, a 6th machine is going to be a lot of work. And everyone understands I do not only have to go to the server room and screw that server in the rack. I'm going to have a ton of configuration as well. That's fine. Nowadays, that's not really relevant anymore. But at the same time, as you're moving from VMs to specifically container technology, it's just a continuation of the virtualization trend, right? It's not that it's something completely different. It's more granular, but from a certain perspective, it's old wine in new wineskins. So that's one of the parts. Like, remember the lessons that you learned there. A lot of them are going to be applicable for whatever you're doing with your containers. And as you're looking at bringing your applications to the cloud, you got to check out how well they adhere to the 12-factor standards. I call it 12-factorifying your existing applications, right? So they lay out different principles and practices of how your application architecture should look so that your application is actually a good cloud-native application that scales elastically, handles its data in a certain way, et cetera, et cetera. Again, remember to do that in baby steps. There are some applications that, by their very essence or nature, are already going to be very close to that ideal, and some applications will not. So for those applications, you might first want to run them in a VM on the cloud before going for container technology. That's going to be different in every situation. One of the large advantages that going to cloud brings to you is the ability to sunset whatever you have in homegrown management interfaces, a bunch of cron jobs you run and stuff like that, which tends to be very organization specific. cloud providers, and that goes both for the Google Cloud, for Azure, and for Amazon AWS. They offer APIs for you that basically do that in a way more effective way than probably the homegrown interface that you have. So as a part of your migration strategy, take a look as well as how you're maintaining these applications, what kind of maintenance interfaces you've got defined, and spot opportunities to sunset those as well, which generally tend to make the 12-factorifying an easier process. So another point that is maybe not as strictly related to architecture infrastructure as the rest, but what I really want to mention, because it is definitely a trend that we're seeing, data is the new oil, right? So cloud and different vendors that are coming out with pretty unique technology allows you to rethink your test data strategies, which might be very effective to roll out as you're going to the cloud. For example, back in the day, refreshing your data from production so your QA environment would have a good set of test data would be a major pain in the neck. You had to not copy the entire production database because that was too much data. You had to think about the anonymization of it, the PCI data, et cetera, because of the speed that we're doing, it's very obvious that a lot of the things that we want to test, we actually want to test that on production data. For example, your database migrations. Why would you wait until you're going to production to see if that schema update that runs successfully on all your other environments, if it actually also runs successfully on production? That used to be sort of more a law, like you can't really do those operations on a multi-terabyte database. But nowadays there are technologies, like for example, the one offered by Delphix that allows you to do that. And that puzzle pieces very nicely in whatever you're doing with cloud. It allows you to automate a lot more of the steps and add that security or a reliance that something is going to actually work in production, so you can rely on your automation a lot more. So there's just like a couple of pointers as you're doing things that you might want to take a look at. So that was a lot of talking. Not that I'm going to stop talking quite yet, but let's take a look at actually some running software as well. So what I'm going to show you is an example of, in this case, the CBI Labs DevOps platform. So this is not just specifically to our platform, right? I mean, these are practices that are generic. Just have a demo kit test case that makes it quite easy to see the concept. But do look at the general story that I'm trying to tell here, and not as much exactly what the platform is doing. So what I've got highlighted here as an architecture overview is a demarcation between two concerns that you might have in your release process. First of all, you want to orchestrate all of your different activities. You see that basically in the top arch called release orchestration. So that is your entire process, soup to nuts. But that process, that enterprise pipeline really, is from a certain perspective doesn't really do a ton of heavy lifting. It just tells all your other tools in your tool chain what to do and retrieves information back. So think of interacting with your continuous integration, merging branches for you automatically, making sure that code analysis ran, that your various hip new security tools were used in your development process, your approvals, your notifications, all of these different concerns that I mentioned earlier for your enterprise pipeline. That's really in the wheelhouse of the orchestration. There is a second concern, that's deployment automation, that can be seen quite independently of the orchestration piece. So whenever I'm deploying, what I'm really only doing is I'm taking a build version and an artifact, and I'm applying that to my various environments. That involves, of course, a ton of technical work. Things need to be generated in order to get that up and running. But from the release orchestration process, consider the fact that for the release orchestration, that looks a little bit more functionally at the deployment. So what it really for release orchestration is, it tells you I want app X version 3 on my dev environment. Okay, now my test environment. Okay, now my production environment, and any more environment you might have. Without having a nitty-gritty knowledge of how those environments really look, right? So in this case, what I'm showing you, the current as-is situation where I'm going to start my demo with, is a dev environment where the developers are really just spinning up local Docker instances to test their application. In my test environment, there's a little bit of a hybrid situation going on. Right now, the production infrastructure, as you see, is on JBoss and Apache. So right now, the test environment is still like sort of 50-50. People are trying to test things with Amazon ECS. So they really want to start using that container technology, but they still want to have that old environment as well. So from the release orchestration perspective, it wouldn't really care. When I'm deploying to test, it just deploys to whatever machines are currently associated with the label test. So that's really that demarcation between release orchestration and deployment automation. You can see that if you do that, your release process, the release orchestration usually is the process that needs a lot more approvals, the sign-offs that this is the right process. So you don't want to touch that too much. That the deployment automation under the hood changes a little bit, those are more technical details that are generally okay. So that's why there's the demarcation. I'm going to show that in my demo as well. And just to show you the after state as well, it's easier than going back and forth between the browser screen and the slideshow. What I'm going to show as a step after is like, what if I want my environment to look like this? So maybe all the testing that I've done in test has shown me, okay, actually these Docker containers are quite reliable. I want to run my main testing campaigns on that, but I want to use the same technology in dev as well, because why would I use local Docker there and AWS Fargate at the other location? Just as a little bit of a highlight of the technologies that we're working with, I assume that Docker, JBoss, and Apache are known to the audience. Just want to call out that AWS Fargate that we're going to be working with is a specific runtime of its EC2 container service, where you are not responsible for maintaining the infrastructure. So basically what you tell to AWS, I want a cluster to run my Docker containers on, and I don't really want to bother myself too much with what kind of hardware that's running on. So I'm just going to tell you what kind of CPU memory my applications sort of need, what the limits are, and you just run it. You make sure that there's the hardware available underneath. As you can imagine, you're not paying for uptime. In that case, you're more paying for like classic CPU ticks or however you want to call it. So the billing model is quite different there. So let me go ahead and switch screen share, which it's always going to be an adventure to see if it works the way that I want to. So let me know if you guys can see my browser screen, or maybe someone of the organizers can. I'm going to take the silence as golden.
Yes, I'm sorry. It's like golden. Yes, I can see your screen.
All right.
I apologize.
Excellent. No worries, no worries. Great. Okay, so what I pulled up right here, what we're seeing on the screen now, is an example of an enterprise pipeline. As I'm doing a webinar in a limited amount of time here, of course, I can't really show all of the concerns that I was talking about. For example, what we spoke about is compliance and security and all of these different concerns. I do want to fit this into a certain time box. We have about 15 minutes to run through this demo. So I'm going to ask you guys to use your imagination, and parts of this is why I'm going to run through this. What I'm going to talk about is okay, this is currently focused on more the deployment, the hybrid situations where you're going from environment to environment. What you'll see here less is security concerns addressed. But just as an FYI, let me explain a little bit of what we're seeing right here before I go on. So this is the release orchestration component of the DevOps platform of CBI Labs. It's not really about our platform specifically, so see this as any enterprise pipeline, and see this as well as a template. So this means that this is reusable. So it's not something, a unicorn that I've defined for just one application or one release. It's very heavily parameterized, which means it can work for multiple applications, which means it can work for multiple types of releases. What this template needs to have addressed is the concerns that I have as an organization. And an example could be, an easy example here is that this virtual organization, for example, wants everything to be updated in JIRA. So have basically the updates as you're doing the various deployments. reflected in JIRA as well, so that that information ends up in multiple different places. There's a lot of different activities that you could add to an enterprise pipeline like that. Like, for example, I talked about security concerns. You would be able to check compliance in various different ways with various different technologies, right? Fortify, Checkmarks, Black Duck are good example, Nexus IQ Server. These can all be sprinkled in here as activities, so you can see how far that goes, as well as the different testing campaigns that you might be running, other JIRA integrations, ServiceNow, et cetera, et cetera. So anything that you really need to do in your enterprise pipeline. So in this demo, really to underline again, what I really want to focus on is to show, hey, how do we switch to these different environments? So in order to do that, I'm going to kick off a new release based on this template. What I do want to mention is that it's important for your release pipeline as well, is this is a visual environment that tends to be really important for your stakeholders in case they want to redesign this, so drag these things around, as well as that to be available as code, right? So you see that as a trend right now a lot in basically our industry. Everything that you're doing in tooling, there's a great UI for that, which is helpful, but make sure that these things are available as code as well. So you can store them in version control, so you can do like your standard engineering practices on that. I'm going to kick off this release manually now. Bear in mind that if you're talking about an enterprise pipeline, the ability to kick it off automatically is very important as well. So for example, in this case, I could have set up a trigger that monitors Artifactory for a new artifact that has been created or something like that. So I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to create this example here, webinar 1. I'm going to kick this off. You did see a couple of variables here there that makes it very configurable. So I did give them reasonable default, but you see now that all of these environment references are pointing to a specific environment that I have, as well as I have a specific application that I'm using here, right? So what I can do now is I can go ahead and I can start this release, which is going to go ahead and create issues in JIRA. I should always say, I'm doing a demo, so there is a demo effect that some things might fail. So far, I'm pretty good. I did skip one part here just because of time, again, because I really want to focus on, hey, how can I very dynamically switch to different environments? So what we're starting out with here is the dev environment. Like I mentioned before, that's just a Docker environment. And I do want to move a little bit quick. I know on a webinar, one should not switch screens too much, but I really want to show you the deployment job as it's running. So what we're seeing in Excel release, that it kicks off the deployment automation component, so separate components, and it's actually starting the deployment under the hood. I get feedback right here that it's running. And what I want to show as well is as I switch to that component and I go to the monitoring piece, I can take a look really at what it's doing. So what we're seeing here is right now, just because how the environments are configured, you see that this is a very example of a local Docker instance that's actually really pulling Docker images, it's spinning them up, just doing all that activity, creating the network as well in order for everything to be available for you, and actually show you the logging as well. Afterwards, you can go ahead and test your Docker instances. So like I mentioned, these are real deployments. So this is actually really downloading and spinning up a Docker container, which is always a scary thing to do at a demo because network connections can always be a little bit less than what you want them to be. But let's go ahead and we can switch back to Excel release while this process of this deployment actually finishes. So you see, I can see here as well that we're on step 2 of 11. All of these different activities will continue. So until we hit this manual validation step, where we can check that the Docker containers were spun up automatically in a correct fashion, et cetera, et cetera. If we skip ahead and take a look at the test environment, what you basically see is that the configuration is very exactly the same. So it's basically using the same provisioning package and the same deployment package, but these packages can be applied to different types of environments. We see right now that we're on step 11 of 11. So if I quickly switch back here, see all of these different steps are done. And if I go back to Excel release real quick, we're going to see that the ticket information was updated as well. I could click on this, actually go to JIRA and see that. This is an example of a manual step where I can still do it. I can go ahead, I can open up this URL, which should have a Docker container running there now. And there we go, we do. And I can complete this and close this down. So one of the important parts to think about as well as you are thinking about doing an enterprise pipeline like this is things like cleaning this up automatically as well. One of the ways to do a lot of cost saving and to really ironclad your process as well is whenever you're done with whatever you do here, and of course there could be a whole testing campaign here, there could be security checks here, to nicely clean up whatever you did. So in this case, these Docker images are now removed. So if I refresh this page, like right now, that port is closed again. And what you will see as well is that it deprovisions that entire environment. So whatever it created specifically for the dev environment, it deprovisions that again. We see that we moved on to the test phase now. So right now I could say that we're ready to go and we could continue. So from this moment, it's going to be very repetitive what we see in Excel release itself. But the cool thing is this provisioning step, because in test, I've got that associated with a different environment. If I go ahead and I take a look here and I refresh this right here, you see that if I open this up, that it's not simply a chef script that's running now. Actually, and again, this is a live demo, so this is actually connecting to AWS. So it's creating a test environment, a test ECS Fargate instance for me, so that in my subsequent step, I can automatically deploy to that. So it creates all of basically that infrastructure for me. And this is something that is a really good practice to do, again, that this is separated in a way that the one part is being controlled by a deployment automation component that knows all the nitty-gritty stuff about what's going on technically, where this release piece is really giving you the high over visibility in what really happens. You see that amount of seconds that passed there and stuff like that. So what it's doing now is actually spinning up the containers on Amazon ECS. So remember, this is the exact same package that I'm using. So that's the flexibility that you get here. I'm sorry, that's the wrong one. Got to refresh this. See that the Pet Portal 3, same package is deploying, but right now it's doing it both. So it's not doing local Docker. It's starting it on an ECS cluster as well as it's deploying to my classic infrastructure. So you can have a hybrid package in here, and that's a good practice as well, so that you can still test this on your classical environment. So that's pretty cool. So as we wait for this to continue, we can go ahead and look forward or move forward to production. And again, from the release perspective, right now, the provisioning and the deploy step looks exactly the same again. There's nothing really special happening here, because again, for the release product, it's just simply the same package, but a different environment. But my production environment, of course, is going to look quite different. If you remember the slideshow, that's still very classical JBoss Apache environment. And you can imagine that my my production environment is actually something that has a lot more machines. It's load balanced in a certain way. So in that case, what we will see as this deployment will start for the production environment, there's a lot more environments that are going to be serviced there. So let me just preemptively complete this. I am aware of the time, so I'm trying to go as fast as I can while we're waiting for the ECS cluster to be cleaned up, which is done automatically as well. I do want to show you a piece of what I mentioned regarding the configuration that we want to reuse that. So right here, this is the definition of that application. My classic infrastructure uses a data source on JBoss. That data source, of course, needs a database username, a password, driver, and stuff like that. Define those in such a way that you can just use a reference. For example, if I look at this container spec that I have right here, we see the very same key pairs here. So they will be substituted on the fly depending on the environment you're going to. But you can see that, for example, the way that we pass that to a Docker container is completely different than how we pass it to JBoss. You can still reuse this configuration. So it's a very simple example. And as well, this is duplicated in the AWS metadata as well, because it's a Fargate instance. It needs information about CPU and soft limits. And the same information again, in this case, it really, because they're both like Docker technology, they look very, very similar. But see that every time it just refers to the key wherever my configuration is stored, and it will basically retrieve that information on the fly as I do that deployment automatically. So let's go ahead, see where the release process is. It is actually deploying to production right now. So let's take a look in the deployment tasks and see how that looks. So what you're seeing here is, as we're talking about legacy deployment, so this platform has been around since 2008. So this is an example of it doing more advanced things like your blue-green deployments as well. So as you're thinking about this hybrid environment situation, it's important to keep thinking about if you're automating your legacy deployments as well. Choose technology that does that in a good way so that you can actually do everything you want to in an automatic fashion. If I would want to introduce parallelism and stuff like that, that's an easy thing to do. Cloud technology is fun because it takes care of so many of these concerns for you. But as long as you're in a hybrid situation, which you are going to be in for quite a while, you're going to rely on this technology still. So make sure that you have something that can orchestrate that nicely for you. So this process is going to, whoops, didn't mean to click there. It's going to complete automatically here. I can complete it here and move forward. What I'm going to do now, and that's probably going to be 4 minutes or something like that, that I'm going to update my environment so that this next release that I'm going to run actually goes into that new state where now I'm running everything on Amazon Fargate. Or not everything, my dev and test, I'm sorry. So how would that really look? So in this environment, right, and remember this is an example I'm giving, you can fix it in many different ways, but I have a mapping to my dev and test environment. If I open up my dev environment, what I clearly see is a mapping to my local Docker. I don't want to deploy to my local Docker anymore, so I remove that. And instead, I use my AWS dev account. So that's generally you have separate credentials for your dev segment, your test segment, et cetera, et cetera. I just map that to the environment. The same I go for test. The test was already pretty much what I wanted. But in this case, what I want to get rid of is my JBoss and Apache server. I no longer want to deploy to those. I trust AWS enough right now. So I just want to do my testing campaign on ECS. I save and close. And that's basically all I do here. So I updated my environments, my references. So what I can do now, and as I can actually go back to my template where I started from. And what I can do is I can start a new release, webinar 2, and I can kick that off and start it. And it's going to go through all of these steps again. So remember, I didn't change anything in my enterprise pipeline, and that's really the key here. What it's going to go do underneath is because I changed the mapping, it's going to provision things in a different way now. So as this is starting up and I go back to Excel deploy, I refresh the active jobs. What I see, instead of the chef script that ran earlier to set up my local Docker, I see right now that I'm getting another Amazon ECS instance, in this case, a dev one, so on a different organization in AWS. So you see that this was just simply done by updating my environment. For the rest, I didn't really do anything. Subsequently, when I do the deployment afterwards, which should show up if I go ahead, close this, and refresh this, what I will see is now that this will be a Docker deployment as well, but not the local Docker variant, but spinning it up very similarly to what we saw in the test environment. You can imagine how this runs onwards. So from this perspective, I really showed you how I update an environment and how you would want to update an environment in this sense, and that your process for the rest, and think of any security steps, approvals, communication steps, etc. you have in there. Nothing had to change. No approvals needed to get. I didn't have to update this process. I only needed to update my environment, and that gives you that flexibility to switch back and forth. I mean, even if I do my test deployment in a little bit and I decide that I want to go back to my classic infrastructure, you can imagine that it's just as easy as mapping my JBoss and my Apache environment again, and then it goes on and does everything that I need to. What I clearly didn't show in this demonstration is anything related to database work. That is, of course, something that you always as well want to address in your through your deployment automation. Really, your database schema updates are part of that as well. Just arbitrary as a choice of scoping for this webinar. Chose not to show that, but I did want to highlight that it is one of the things that you want to take care of very distinctly there as well. Cool. So I would propose, especially because we have a couple of things that we want to do at the end of the webinar, and we want some to answer some questions. I'm going to let this keep running, and I'll show as well as we're doing the deployment to test that it's going to look different. But I would like to stop, give the opportunity to answer a couple of questions.
Okay, great. Just a reminder for the audience, if you have a question for Vincent about any of today's presentation, just go ahead and use your GoToWebinar control panel and submit your questions. We have time for a few of them, so we'll go ahead and jump right on in. First question, does CBI Labs offer an enterprise DevOps platform?
Well, yeah, we absolutely do. Of course, like everything that I've been showing here so far is part of that platform. So that's not quite a coincidence. So everything that you're seeing here is part of that. Yeah.
Okay, and then how about is it a SaaS environment?
What we mainly do is these are actually solutions that run, they can run in the cloud, of course, but they run basically in your control, in your data center or your AWS cloud for the reasons of the data that they're able to access. And generally, organizations prefer to not have that as a SaaS solution. So that's not a technical limitation. Our products run as Docker containers, of course, as well. But right now, indeed, generally, you run them yourselves.
Okay, great. The next question here, does CBI Labs offer third-party plugin integration in its platform?
I will answer that question, but I will first highlight the fact that we're deploying on the test environment right now. You no longer see the JBoss and Apache, so I just wanted to complete that part, so we weren't waiting on that. And of course, I forgot, the question was third-party integrations in our...
Yes. Does it offer third-party plugin integration? Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's a great question. Let me just really show this in the demo environment as well. Yeah, both the deployment component and the release component have integrations in a plethora of different environments. It's not limited by what I'm showing you in my demo environment, but this is really something that is very important for our business, our ability to integrate with everything. And we have that documented on our website. You might want to check out our periodic table of DevOps tools, which highlights all the technologies we can integrate with. And I'm sure we can make that part of the webinar page when it's downloadable for at a later stage.
Okay, excellent, excellent. Okay, just a quick reminder, I think we can get to one or two more questions. So if you have one, go ahead and submit it using the GoToWebinar control panel. So the next question here is, let's see. Okay, this is kind of a statement, so I'm wondering if it's actually a question or not. But mapping to different clouds will trigger the job via SSH or just shows deployment phase completed? It sounds like an either or.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I'll try to interpret it as best as I can in this situation. So when we're talking about deploying to cloud environments, there's basically two levels of integrations we do. First of all, it can be the infrastructure as a service integration, in which case, indeed, yes, we connect to the machine that you're running in the cloud, just like it would be a virtual machine in your data center. So SSH for Linux, WinRM for Windows, and just treat it like a machine. If it's about Docker containers, we integrate with the APIs of the Google platforms or of the platforms themselves, be it Google, AWS, or Azure. So we don't leverage SSH at that point. We just integrate with the relevant endpoints.
Okay. All right. Great. We have one more question here, and then I think is there anything left in your demo that you need to point out, Vincent?
No,
I want to give you time to do that.
No, I'm just clicking through because I like clicking in things, but for the rest, I'm done.
Okay. That may be too much information, but that's okay. Okay. All right. Then the looks like the final question then is actually no, there's one or two more. Does the product support Lambda deployments in AWS?
Yes, we absolutely do. So indeed, if you want to follow up, like make sure to contact us. We have demos of that as well. But it's serverless and Lambda deployments are possible. Yep.
Okay, great. And then what about, do you support Solaris?
Yep, we do as well. I have a little bit less detailed knowledge of that. But again, please feel free to follow up with us. We do have that documented and available.
Okay, all right, great. And next question. Is the CBI Labs a dynamic environment for build and release? I think that's what this question is asking.
So our environment is really focused on release and deployment. So we're not a continuous integration platform. We don't build software, right? We orchestrate the release and we take the build package and we deploy that to various environments, but we don't build it ourselves. We can orchestrate the build, as in we call Jenkins, Bamboo, Azure DevOps to do that for us, but we don't do it ourselves, if that makes sense.
Okay, all right, great. Okay, looking at the time, we're going to have to close out the question and answer period for this webinar. And I want to thank everybody who did submit a question. If you have a question for Vincent that you didn't get in and you still want to, go ahead and submit it using the GoToWebinar control panel. And I'm sure the folks at CBI Labs will be more than happy to follow up with you offline. But I also want to remind the audience that today's event has been recorded. So we'll be sending out an email post-event so that you'll be able to listen to it again. Whether you want to listen to part of it or all of it, you'll have the opportunity to do so. The webinar is also going to be on the DevOps.com website for your listening and viewing pleasure. Just go to webinars, the webinar section on the website, and then click on demand, and it should be right there. Now, okay, without further ado, I do want to do our drawing for the 5 lucky winners of the $50 Amazon gift card. So they are, let's see, first big winner is Bob E, which I think is Bob E. Bell. So congratulations, Bob. Second winner is George or Jorge Hernandez. Congratulations, Jorge. Third winner is Nishanth Narayanan, and I apologize if I butchered your name, Nishanth, but congratulations. Fourth winner is Scott Alye, A-L-Y-E-A. Congratulations, Scott. And the final winner today is Rikwan Best. Congratulations, Rikwan, and congratulations to everybody who did win a gift card. And Vincent, I would like to give you a big shout out for giving such a great presentation. I know I got a lot out of it, so I'm sure the audience did too, judging from the questions we got.
Awesome, thank you.
Awesome, awesome. All right, great. Well, I also want to thank the audience for joining me today. And this is Charlene O'Hanlon, and I'm signing off. Have a great day, everybody.